Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
I have some bad news and good news. Our speaker is with us. That's good news. The bad news is she's with us via Skype. She is trapped in her home in Los Angeles because of all of the bicycling and sports events. And we all became aware of this yesterday when she called me. She says, "Oh, there's no way I can be there." And I said, "Not to worry. Our colleagues in the technology department will fix us up, and we will be able to Skype you." So God bless her for being very flexible. She actually went on Skype yesterday afternoon. They had a rehearsal. They've had a rehearsal this morning. And so we are going to be able to be with her and learn a great deal from her. And I'm very, very excited about what she's going to talk about this morning. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Diane Winston. She holds the Knight Chair in Media and Religion at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC, a national authority on religion and the media as both a journalist and a scholar. Her expertise includes religion, politics, and the news media, as well as religion and the entertainment media. Professor Winston's current research interests are media coverage of Islam, religion and new media, and the place of religion in American identity. At USC, she teaches courses that examine religion as it relates to journalism and visual media, American history, and foreign policy. Her class on international religion reporting has taken students to cover conflict and coexistence in Israel and Palestine, and their subsequent work has appeared in outlets including the Washington Post, the Jerusalem Post, and Huffington Post. Hollywood, Faith, and Media, her class on spirituality and ethics on television dramas, has hosted writer-directors such as David Shore of House, Nancy Franklin of Saving Grace, and Ron Moore of Battlestar Galactica. The guest lectures are available on YouTube. And Professor Winston has hosted conferences on post-9/11 television and the war on terror, religion, electoral politics, and Islam and the news media. The great thing is that I could go on and on and on because she has so many expertises. But I want to get on to hearing from her. So I want you to welcome her, and then she and I'll have a few just connecting comments to make, and then she has some prepared remarks to share. But will you please warmly join me in welcoming Diane Winston. Good morning.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for that gracious welcome, and hi to everybody. I hope I can join you actually in the flesh one of these days.
We will definitely have you, Diane. It's great for you to be so magnanimous with your time and flexibility to be with us this morning. So, we've got a room full of folks. We're ready to hear from you. You tell us when you're ready to receive some questions and answers, and we'll go from there.
Great. I have some prepared remarks, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, okay?
Great. Very good.
If religion and politics make strange bedfellows, how about the menage a trois of the moment, religion, politics, and the news media? Why is it that the only religion journalists seem to care about is the kind that supports conservative politics? Several years ago, a national survey found major newspapers quoted conservative religious leaders almost 3 times as frequently as their moderate counterparts, and on TV the ratio was 4-to-1. The result? Political legitimacy is bestowed on a religious minority. In our time together, I want to talk about how that happened. I will provide some journalism history, touch on religion and American identity, and then on the rise of the religious right. Its success at marginalizing religious moderates and progressives has strengthened the perception that American religion is conservative religion. Before finishing, I hope to have explained how we came to where we are today and to offer some hope for change. Since 2000, many American journalists have had a come-to-Jesus experience, spurred by the rise of politicized religion and religious politics. Politicized religion and religious politics. But the news media's fascination with religion and politics is just the latest two-step in a long-standing dance. When New England colonists began cataloging and circulating news of important events, they framed their story with a religious perspective. Divine providence played a decisive role in covering and interpreting everyday occurrences. Media historian David Paul Nord said, quote, "The characteristics of American news, its subject matter, the world around us, and its method of reporting, objective empiricism, are deeply rooted in the religious culture of 17th century New England." Likewise, religious studies scholar Tracy Fessenden surveyed 3 centuries of American literature to show how a specific Protestant identity, open to tolerance and pluralism, but protective of white privilege, heterosexism, and capitalism, became the default mode for American public life. This default setting, often called public Protestantism, served as a dominant frame for much of the 20th century. But its lack of Christian triumphalism and infrequent references to either sin or soul winning seemed so far removed from traditional religion that a political movement of Protestant evangelicals and conservative Catholics joined forces to challenge it. The mainstream media initially dismissed Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority as redneck religion, but public response to Richard John Newhouse's 1984 bestseller, The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America, demonstrated a pent-up appetite for the inclusion of faith-based ideas and values in public life. But religion already was part of public life. It had been part of the news mix since the 1830s, when James Gordon Bennett, penny press pioneer, realized it made great copy. The real issue was not whether to cover religion, but whose religion was covered and how it was presented. For example, the amount of religion coverage has remained constant between 1893 and 1998, but the type shifted. Substantive reporting, coverage on the substance of faith, and initially done through daily devotionals and sermons reprinted in the paper, evolved into stories about theology and politics. Functional coverage, linking religion and everyday life to illustrate the function of faith in society, gradually changed from human interest pieces about good works to hard news about religious conflict. In 1984, religious conservatives received little substantive or functional coverage, but in the last 25 years, they altered the dominant news narrative. Why? How did that happen? Most reporters don't get religion, not because they are atheists or even opposed to it, but because of journalism itself. Today's newspapers evolved from the penny press, cheap newspapers for working men that replaced more expensive subscriber-based partisan journals. Even though religious swindles, scandals, and scallywags were fair game for 19th century reporters, respect and reverence for traditional religion was still evident in news columns and opinion pages throughout the 19th century. But by the century's close, as legal and scientific authorities gained status in a society grown progressively more professionalized and secularized, editors and publishers also actively sought to minimize the role of traditional religion. Editors and publishers actively sought to minimize the role of traditional religion. These advocates for professionalizing journalism believed that their field was best suited, and I'm quoting them, best suited to succeed religion in the modern world. Editors, recognizing their authority to explain and interpret events, encouraged reporters to be readable, which also was good for sales. Part of being readable was being exciting, and in the 1920s, a New York Timesman told his staff to treat conflict as a key element in reporting and writing. Noting the space devoted to clergy sexual scandals, and yes, they are nothing new, he said, quote, "If theology and religion envy sex and crime and want for front-page space, all that theology and religion need to do is to produce a good personal encounter." These two trends, the declension of religion's prestige in the larger culture and the rise of the conflict narrative, converged dramatically in the 1925 Scopes trial. Following H.L. Mencken's vivid stories of Tennessee buffoonery, the newspaper painted pictures of Williams Jennings Bryan and his supporters as troglodytes. The actual arguments and the outcome and the larger context for the debate over teaching evolution were rarely mentioned. This model, treating true believers as fools and men of science as heroes, defined mainstream coverage for the next 50 years and served the newspaper's desire of instating themselves over religion as social arbiters. The polarization had epistemological as well as practical utility. It validated the scientific method of the world, and it provided a lot of colorful copy. Religious people may have protested against war, injustice, and discrimination, but most of their activities fell way below the radar. Between the 1940s and 60s, several great men commanded media headlines. Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich embodied the national conscience. Men like Mahatma Gandhi and David Ben-Gurion were international superstars. Then, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement captured the public's imagination. When television cameras caught Bull Connor, a latter-day pharaoh armed with dogs, whips, and hoses, terrorizing an oppressed people, the images seared the Exodus narrative and its new Moses on the national psyche. The Civil Rights Movement attracted unprecedented print and broadcast coverage, partly due to timing. Mass media had made possible instantaneous coast-to-coast communication. Newspapers were reaching national audiences by the turn of the century, and radio followed in the 1920s. By the mid-50s, almost half of American households owned television sets. King's biographers disagree about just how savvy the young minister was, but the movement's telegenic protests and silver-tongued leader drew national coverage to bus boycotts, sit-ins, school desegregations, and marches. Ironically, the historic moment at which King's crusade caught fire was the height of the secular revolution. Mid-century Americans believed that science and technology were twin engines of American progress. Less than a decade after President Eisenhower inserted God into the Pledge of Allegiance and onto the nation's currency, the Supreme Court ejected prayer and Bible reading from the public schools. King's leadership channeled disparate tributaries into a mighty river of progressive evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Roman Catholics, Unitarians, Jews, and much of the African American church. But this reinvigoration of religious liberalism was short-lived. When King turned to issues of poverty, labor, and Vietnam, he was criticized by fellow civil rights workers, savaged by politicians, and excoriated in the news media. The broad civil rights coalition fell apart after his death, and another religiously inspired mass movement arose. The Reverend Jerry Falwell said King's successes inspired his founding of the Moral Majority, an interreligious conservative coalition which surged to national attention in the 1980s. Falwell and his fellow supporters received backing from Republican political operatives, and the new movement rapidly grew. Saving unborn lives and supporting traditional family values gave it a defining cause, a fundraising strategy, and an opening salvo in what became the culture war. The strident debate over abortion provided ongoing headlines, and much of the media missed an equally important story unfolding at the same time. In the late 1970s, a small group of Southern Baptists announced their plans to take over their denomination. With 13 million members then and 16 million now, the Southern Baptist Convention is the nation's largest Protestant denomination. SBC conservatives were open about their intention. They wanted to end what they saw as a liberal drift in seminaries, Sunday schools, and mission boards. By drawing a theological red line within the denomination, they hoped members would support conservative social and political views. Conservative Baptists were disillusioned with their secular success. President Jimmy Carter was one of their own, and he seemed like a big disappointment. The tipping point came with the Mullah's revolution in Iran. When American revolutionaries took 54 Americans hostage, when Islamic revolutionaries took 54 Americans hostage, Carter, foregoing the use of force, could not free his countrymen. To SBC conservatives, it was all of a piece. If liberalism were not stopped, it would drain their denomination's vitality, just as it had sapped the nation's strength. The strategy succeeded, and by the mid-1980s, the denomination had turned right. Many Southern reporters repeated the moderate Baptist warning that the takeover was a dry run for the Republican Party. But when the national media parachuted in, all they saw were pompadoured preachers vying over fundamentalism. The issues in play for the SBC, traditional family values, America's divine destiny, and Christianity as a nation's organizing principle, were central 15 years later during the 2000 presidential race here in the United States. The same concern that had split the denomination, traditional values versus cosmopolitan ones, or in practical terms, the authority of the Bible over the New York Times, was key to the GOP strategy. George W. Bush anchored his campaign in the language of personal piety. Jesus was his favorite philosopher who changed his life. Throughout the campaign and for several years after, members of the press were unwilling or unable to query this religious rhetoric. Instead, the echoing press amplified and legitimated what communication scholar David Domke calls political fundamentalism. Why did most of the mainstream media miss the SBC takeover and only intermittently cover the rise of the religious right? How did reporters fail to see the transformation of the Republican Party into a haven for religious conservatives? And what made it possible for the religious right's ideological frame to shape news coverage of religion and politics? The simple answer is that many journalists did not understand what they saw. They had ideological blinders which did not allow them to take religious conservatives seriously, and they worked under narrative conventions, a belief in balance over common sense, that stopped them from understanding that religious conservatives could be savvy political operators whose machinations might need to be exposed. Even when repeating the right's religious formulas during the 2000 presidential debates or President Bush's post-9/11 speeches, reporters never doubted their grasp of events or their own objectivity. Few questioned how they might have become part of the story. They also had missed the start of a campaign to defund and delegitimate mainline Protestant moderates and progressives. This plan proceeded on two tracks: internally fomenting dissension over the role of gender and sexuality in mainline denominations, and externally using the secular press to air allegations against religious moderates. Although these efforts have been documented by historians and reported in alternative and online media, the mainstream press never mentions its own role in the right's strategy to sideline progressive religion. The Institute for Religion and Democracy, a conservative think tank organized in 1980, played a central role in both campaigns. During the waning days of the Cold War, IRD leaders complained that, quote, numerous Christian leaders and some churches associated with the National Council of Churches advocated a moral symmetry between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Subsequent stories in Reader's Digest and 60 Minutes, two of the nation's most popular news outlets, claimed the NCC leaders funded Marxist guerrillas, liberation theology, and other communist fronts. Today, IRD and like-minded organizations still accuse the NCC and other mainline Protestant groups of leftist bias. Each time a news outlet runs an article on a current charge, it contextualizes the debate within the old reporting. As a result, stories hinge on the mainline's intentions, are they leftist or not, rather than its activities. As a result, mainline social and political initiatives are discredited among the general public and tainted within their own ranks. The IRD also cultivated fifth-column forces to promote denominational schism. These forces made debates over sexual orientation, be it the ordination of gays and lesbians, same-sex marriage, and acceptance of GLBT people as church members in good standing, into wedge issues among Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians. Supporting opponents of sexual deviance, the IRD impeded mainline fundraising and alienated membership. They also stymied efforts to address issues of poverty, climate change, and international relations as the press fixated on the conflict over homosexuality. Remember my early remarks about sex and religion and how they make for good headlines. Even as the religious right blocked efforts of a progressive religious movement, its media strategy bolstered its own social and political agenda. Confirmation of its success? Between January 2005 and June 2006, 10 general interest magazines and 6 daily newspapers ran 370 pieces that mentioned the religious right and 60 that cited the religious left, liberal, progressives, or moderates. 370 to 60. Several factors explain that imbalance. Augmenting the religious right's media skills was the political right's linkage of patriotic and religious rhetoric. After 9/11, the Bush government yoked American politics to the conservative Christian project, and the press repeated the message without question or comment for nearly 5 years. Why did it take the mainstream media so long to interrogate the president's religious rhetoric and the significance of religion in public life? In part, the echoing press reflects the political climate. But it also underscores the news media's ignorance of both the role and the rhetorical significance of religion in Americans' lives. The press assumes that the person who says he is the most religious must be the most religious. Accordingly, by thumping on a Bible and quoting Jesus, many conservatives convinced reporters that they are the most authentic Christians. It's hard for those who don't brandish their faith in the same way to compete, even if they do represent as many people. Moreover, the press assumes that some people are more worth covering than others. These are usually people in powerful positions, whether in terms of money, power, or followers, and they do tend to be white, male, and well-spoken. This makes it hard for local faith-based activists, not to mention women, people of color, poor people, or people from religious outgroups, whether Pentecostals or New Agers, to get a hearing. Last but not least, the crisis in the news industry, the increasing number of media conglomerates beholden to the bottom line, has blunted journalistic muckraking. We can see that here in our local newspaper. That's why newspapers told us Saddam Hussein had WMDs and our banking system was the best in the world. Publishers are wary of offending audiences and advertisers, especially over highly volatile issues, whether economic, political, or religious. So, that's the bad news. But I do have some positive headlines. Online sites and social media have made it possible to share alternate perspectives. If you want to read about religion and politics, you can Google Religion Dispatches or any number of bloggers who have their own sites or publish at Huffington Post, Alternate, or Talk to Action. Likewise, if you want to get your story told, there are new ways for you to DIY, do it yourself. The mainstream media no longer has a monopoly on setting the news agenda. If religious progressives stop looking to the New York Times and the Washington Post for validation and start tweeting, Facebooking, and developing their own news alternatives, they won't need to take back the narrative. They can create their own. Thank you, and I'd love to hear your comments on where you think religion, the news media, and politics are today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Diane, while you were speaking, I was having a glory attack. Just thankful that you are training journalists at USC. I'm just grateful for your intellect and what I consider to be your ministry. So thank you very much for sharing with us. So let's see what kind of questions we have. We have mics that are ready to come to you. Anything that Diane said that, yes, here we go, is the first one. And let's go ahead and get the mic to the second one so we don't, very good, so we know who the second one will be. So please, Chris.
You mentioned alternative media and do-it-yourself. Are the numbers anywhere, is it ever going to be possible for those media to compete with broadcast and cable news like Fox and CNN in sheer numbers of people that see what's presented there? Aside from something that goes completely viral.
More and more online sites are reaching hundreds of thousands of people. You're right. They probably do not have as many as Fox News or O'Reilly, but they do reach hundreds of thousands of people, and there is always a chance of going viral. Doing a bottom-up campaign is a different way of thinking than doing top-down, but I think we've seen over the years, whether it was the Saffron Revolution or Arab Spring or even the Occupy movement, that you don't always need to capture the mainline news media in order to get a message out and to make a difference.
Question back here.
I was wondering about whether there should be a third category. So more like a K Street, I think that's K Street ideology. Because it seems like there are, so you think about Catholics. Catholics are united on the homosexual against being homosexuals and abortion, but they, on immigration, on war, they seem to be outside of the, so it seems like there's a different, I don't know, it's like a different ideology than, it seems like it's just like this conservative ideology, and then religion comes to supplement that, rather than, because I mean there are people who are like Catholic, like Santorum, who reject their own church's position a lot of times.
Yes. I mean, trying to set up easy characterizations and classifications for religion and politics will never work because there are always people who don't fit into the boxes. But what's been very interesting about the current rise of the religious right and over the last 25 years is the fact that people who don't necessarily agree on all theological and political issues have managed to work together. And if you had told someone in 1960 that Catholics and Protestants were going to, and Orthodox Jews were going to make common cause over issues, they would have laughed at you. And what the religious right has done is to pick issues that people can rally around despite whether or not they fit into a holistic religious and political categorization. And Santorum happens to be a great example of that, because you can well imagine that evangelicals 30 years ago would never have supported him as a candidate. And yet he's able to talk language and to come out in favor of certain policies that, ironically, don't necessarily always fit his church, don't necessarily always fit evangelicals, but still manage to work into common cause on political campaigns, right?
Where is it now? Yeah.
Professor, what do you think about the press coverage of the apparent growing schism between the Catholic nuns and the American Catholic bishops?
I'd be curious to hear what you think about that. I think that's one example where sort of doing balanced coverage is perpetuating an imbalance. The story of what Catholic nuns have been in this country and how much they have done for the church can't possibly be contextualized in a short news piece. And the ongoing struggle that they've faced from the church hierarchy, both for their independence and their interpretation of what being a Catholic is, can't be summed up in a 20-second quote. So by virtue of the medium, by virtue of the fact that most mainline news outlets have to do things quick and dirty, you're never going to get the full story of what's going on there. But that's my opinion. I'd be curious to hear what you think.
Here we go.
This morning's New York Times has a front page article on Mormonism and the impact it has or may be having on Mitt Romney. I did not read it as yet. It's very, very long. And it's my experience, it's the first article of this kind in a mainstream article that's really attempted to get at how Mormonism may affect Romney's thinking and his values. I expect to see a lot more of this, and my question is, how do you see the media dealing with this very complex and very tricky question?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I wish I had read that story this morning so I could comment on it, because that is really interesting. I managed to get the paper from my front porch to my dining room table, which in itself was an accomplishment, but I have yet to read it. Now, Mitt Romney, as I understand it, has done his best to try to make his faith a non-issue in the campaign. Obviously, he's not been tremendously successful in that. He's made it, as part of that, he's tried not to talk about its impact on him. However, that seems to be something that most Americans want to know about. And I think they not only want to understand what it means in terms of political decisions, but also how it's affected his life choices. You know, how he looks at marriage, why he gives so much money to tithing, how he's been a leader within the church. And it will help us understand him more as a whole, full-blooded, rounded person, to understand the role of faith in his life, especially since, by all indications, this is one of the primary facets of his identity. So I think that we will see more of those stories if reporters can get them. The question is how will they be done? Will they be thoughtful accounts by people who actually know something about Mormonism and who try to make sense of the complexity of that religion? Or will they be, short, stupid pieces that take pot shots and that make matters more confused than clarified?
Great. Where is it? Show me where the mic is. Oh, please.
Right here. Back to the Catholic Church. 10 days ago, there was a short Associated Press article on the American Catholic bishop's condemnation of the Girl Scouts because of their, mainly because of their supposed promotion of birth control, and specifically mentioning Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, Dolores Huerta, and Sierra Club as groups that have promoted a contraception that the Girl Scouts have been connected with. Catholic Girl Scouts are a fairly sizable portion of the Girl Scouts, and there's a pressure growing to join a different group rather than the Girl Scouts. There's been virtually nothing in the press about this, and that seems to me to be a major story.
I agree with you that that is a fascinating story and something which deserves coverage. One of the problems today in the media, in the traditional news media, is that, as you know, budgets have been cut back to the bone, and the news hole, the space allotted for news as opposed to advertisements, has shrunken. So there are many good stories and many important stories that aren't being covered. That's the kind of piece that you should have someone who is somewhat conversant with religion and who also knows something about the politics of, reproductive rights on board to do it. Many papers may not want to throw the resources at something like that. Now that's an example of the problem we're having in journalism today. The fact that a lot of important stories don't get covered because a lot of other things do get covered. How much coverage did we need to have about the Facebook IPO? Yes, that is a big business story, but it seemed like that got an inordinate amount of press, partly because of Mark Zuckerberg's notoriety, partly because of the money, partly because of the Facebook phenomena, but that ate up a lot of resources that could have gone other places. Now, I don't know how much the Girl Scout controversy has been on alternate news sites. That would be interesting to see who's covering it and how it's being covered.
Last question back here. Sarah?
I'd be interested to hear you comment on the way in which the American media kowtows to AIPAC on Israel. And do you see that changing as increasing number of Jews speak out about Israeli policies?
That is a very tough question because I don't think the issue vis-a-vis with Israel is necessarily linked to the Jewish community. I think it's linked to the evangelical community. There are a lot more evangelicals who support the Israeli government than there are Jews, just in terms of sheer numbers and in terms of political clout. I don't think most newspapers want to take on AIPAC. I don't think most Jews want to take on AIPAC, and certainly most rabbis don't want to take on AIPAC. It's sort of a no-win situation. And I also think that the issue there for Jews is very thorny. No matter how we feel about Israel in our community, it's hard to criticize it, even if we could, publicly. I think the issue there that might be more profitable in terms of making a change is to go after evangelical support of Israel, because that has more it has very strong political links. It has, a theological backing that is somewhat problematic to Jews if they really thought about it. And it is as important in terms of size, scale, and finances as is the AIPAC Jewish support for Israel.
Thanks, Diane. Great answer. Before you end, let me ask one last question. Would you venture to give us the names of journalists that you want to read every week or every month, that you trust to express the kinds of values and self-criticism and investigation that you've talked about today?
Well, I don't know if I would name names so much as I would tell you what I read. I really like Religion Dispatches. Religion Dispatches is an independently funded site that focuses on progressive religious coverage. I also like Talk to Action. Talk to Action's, another news site that has done a lot of reporting on the religious right. I think that Global Post for international coverage offers perspectives on religion internationally that you can't find many other places. So it's not so much individual reporters for me, also Truthdig started by my colleague Bob Scheer at USC. That's another great site for local and national coverage that isn't reported in the mainstream media. So it's not so much about reporters per se, it's about places to look. I also try to look at BBC, I try to look at Al Jazeera, I try to look at other international news sites that may take a different perspective or report on stories from a slightly different angle than we get them here in the U.S.
Very helpful. We're very grateful. Thank you so much, Diane. And we'll have you here next time. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you.